Come in from the rain. Know that you are warm and welcome here. It's a great day to be in Webster County because it's raining. We have an abundance of time. I know everybody's conscious of clocks and things like that. So we'll start promptly with a wonderful session that I'm looking forward to hearing. A Lost Lady Ecocritical Perspectives. And I will introduce each speaker before they speak, and then we'll take questions at the end as we've been doing all along. Our first speaker is Hiro Ariyoshi. He from the University of Alabama. Hiro is a PhD student at the University of Alabama. After earning a BA and an MA in Kyoto and Tokyo, Japan, he came to the United States to study 20th century American literature. His research interest is in Southern literature. I think that's Cather too, depending on what church you attend, and eco-criticism and translation studies. He is working as a translator of American literature into Japanese. Hiro, start us off.
Thank you for having me. I took a walk after lunch to see the Garber's place, to get the good vibes from the place, and I got dirt on my shoes. I'm going to talk about trees and birds in A Lost Lady. Let me start my presentation with something about Japan, where I'm from. In Studio Ghibli's animated film, Princess Mononoke, set in medieval Japan, appears the character named Kodama, which literally translates as tree soul, the spirit that dwells in trees. They are small white spirits in human form, as in this picture. In the movie, a character explains about them as follows. If you let them do as they please, they won't do anything bad. They are the sign that the forest is rich. Of course, they are fictional characters, but some people claim that they have taken photos of them in the real world. And those photos go viral on Twitter and Instagram from time to time. So in this photograph, you can see white circles and black dots that look like Kodama, the spirit. For me, they look just the light reflecting off the rain, but the popularity of these photos suggests that people want to believe that the tree spirit exists. Animistic beliefs are common in Japan. Giant trees tend to be objects of worship, and shrines were built in forests with such trees. This way of thinking that finds spirits in trees is not unique to Japan. Cather's novel, O Pioneers, tells the story of a custom of worshipping trees in Bohemia before Christianity was introduced. Mary, the daughter of a family of immigrants who came to Nebraska from Bohemia, says, the Bohemians, you know, were tree worshippers before the missionaries came. Father says the people in the mountains still do queer things sometimes. They believe that trees bring good or bad luck. This way of finding spirits in trees also appears in My Antonia. The narrator, Jim Burton, who immigrated to Nebraska from Virginia, talks of Nebraska's lack of trees. Quote, trees were so rare in that country, and they had to make such a hard fight to grow that we used to feel anxious about them and visit them as if they were persons, end quote. Caddo was a writer who was conscious of the interaction between trees and humans. So the tree is an important imagery in The Lost Lady too. The woodcut illustration by Bernhard Kulebo in the Century magazine serialization of the novel, which the first edition of Knopf in 1923 adopted as the artwork for the dust cover, shows the lane to the forester's house, which Lombardy populars on both sides of it. These rows of trees, which occupies 2/3 of the screen, indicates that it is the main stage of this story, along with the house placed in the center of the frame. Behind the house, you can see the top of the cottonwood grove. Critics have often pointed out that Caddo was an acute observer of nature. Especially, they have shown the farmers' lives in the fauna and flora on the prairie in Caddo's early novels, such as O Pioneers, My Antonia, and The Song of the Lark. Regarding her works in late 1920s, when the author's interest moved to the Southwest, scholars examined the interaction between the people there and the unique terrain of the mountains and high desert. These scholarly works have enriched the readings of Cadder's novels, but compared to these novels, A Lost Lady has been analyzed less through the lens of ecocriticism. For example, none of the 16 articles in Cadder Studies Volume 5, Willa Cadder's Ecological Imagination, treats the novel as the main subject. Perhaps this is because the novel's railroad aristocrats, the upper class of Nebraska at the end of the 19th century, seemingly do not have direct contact with the nature around them as farmer characters in early novels do. However, nature is unimportant in The Lost Lady as in other works. In this presentation, I will argue that Cadder uses the imagery of the tree and the birds, among other natural objects, to enrich the novel on two levels. First, I will show the historical significance of the cottonwood tree, which Daniel Forrester, in accordance with his name, plants and protects. Also, I will demonstrate that Cadder gives Daniel Forrester the imagery of trees, which at the same time protects and confines the bird, Marian Forrester. A rare example that focuses on the trees in The Lost Lady is Linnea M. Fredrickson's master's thesis submitted to the University of Nebraska, titled A Literary and Field Guide to Trees in Willa Cather's Nebraska Novels. Fredrickson devotes one chapter to the cottonwoods of A Lost Lady, among 4 other novels set in Nebraska: O Pioneers, My Antonia, One of Ours, and Lucy Gayheart, and analyzes how they work in the novella. My research will add more to this work to expand the readings in the centennial year of A Lost Lady. So, let me talk about the historical background of the cottonwood tree on the prairie first. The cottonwood, which is called the pioneer of the prairie, was an important tree for early settlers of the prairie. According to Nancy Evans and Becky Erdkamp, quote, in the mid-1800s, when the first settlers ventured into the area that is now Nebraska, they encountered a land that was largely void of trees, end quote. you can find the feeling of lack that the settlers felt in the treeless plains that differed from the landscape of their homelands in Jim Burton's narrative I quoted earlier. They began planting the fast-growing cottonwood, which grows on wetland along the rivers, for for using it as building material and for many other purposes in their lives. In the late 800s, Nebraska Territory earned the nickname the Tree Planted State. The cottonwood has been remembered as the tree representing the prairie, becoming the state tree of Kansas in 1937 and of Nebraska in 1972. Cather depicts Forrester's house and forest mostly faithful to the model, the place of Silas Garber. According to Susan J. Rozowski and Carrie A. Roning, Garber planted cottonwoods in 1873 on the hills east of Red Cloud. The fast-growing trees soon became a cottonwood grove, and 6 years later, Garber built his home in the grove. The picnics they held in the woods in the 1880s were the social center of the city. Rozowski and Roning say that Lyra Garber, who modeled Marian Forrester, was the social leader in the picnic. The cottonwood grove was dear to Cather. Teenage Cather attended the Garber family picnic. In a letter in 1889, Cather wrote that she had attended 15 picnics that summer. Memories of this time may have led to the depictions in the novella, such as the boys' picnic at the beginning of A Lost Lady. Cather also advocated for the protection of cottonwood trees in the 1920s when they began to be cut down. When she connects pioneers and cottonwood by saying, the pioneers feel that the cottonwoods are bound up with their lives, and talked about the trees, it almost sounds like she's talking about disappearing pioneers. Quote, yet everywhere the tall, rugged trees are being cut down, cottonwoods are out of date. The maple is the thing. The relationship between cottonwood and maple overlaps with that between the pioneers, represented by Daniel Forrester, and the new generation of Ivy Peters in A Lost Lady. As the narrator, Neil, glorifies the way Daniel Forrester is, Cather claims cottonwood is the tree that should be in Nebraska. Quote, a flat country like Nebraska needs great forking trees like cottonwoods or poplar. The poplar gets killed in winter in Nebraska, but it also does that in Lombardy. The cottonwood is the only tree of beautiful form that grows easily and naturally in this state without any care. The Lombardy poplar, planted on both sides of the lane leading to the forester's house, is a variety similar to cottonwoods, but native to Italy. It was the box elders that were planted in the Garber family lane, but Cather changed this into her favorite species. Cather regards the dear Lombard poplar as, quote, the gayest and saddest of trees, rustling green and silver in the sunlight, end quote. From this statement, it is clear that she sees trees as having personality. So I move on to the textual analysis here. In A Lost Lady, trees are not only important as historical background, but also enrich the work as imagery in the text. The first tree to appear in the book is the fine cottonwood grove behind Forester's house, describing the spreading branches as sheltering arms to left and right. Cather has them protect the house and the people and animals that gather there. The depiction of Cottonwood as a protector corresponds to Daniel Forrester, while he is still in good health, protecting the animals that live there by not allowing guns on his property. The woodpecker, whose eyes Ivy Peters has cut, returns to the hole in the cottonwood tree where she nests for protection. The protective power of trees is present not only in this cottonwood forest, but also in other parts of this novella. Before Marian and her fiancé fall off a cliff, the fiancé falls onto a rock and dies instantly. But Marian is, quote, caught in a pine tree which arrested her fall, and she survives, protected by the tree. When Daniel Forrester finds and rescues her, Marian feels that she suffers less while he is carrying her. Again, Cather juxtaposes the protective power of trees and Daniel Forrester. Cather also metaphorically compares Daniel Forrester, who gradually becomes unwell and motionless, to a tree by clearly saying he looked like an old tree walking. While he is in good health, Daniel Forrester has taken root in the new land as a pioneer and protected people and animals as cottonwoods do. And also, he is gradually changing into a tree himself. Citing the same simile, Fredrickson says, in agreement with me, the trees seem to be the captain himself, not quite gone from the earth. If Daniel Forrester is a tree, Marian is the bird. Both the female woodpecker returning to her hole and Marian being rescued by a tree have in common the image of the bird being protected by the tree. In addition, while Neil holds Marian, who is sleeping in a white hat on a hammock set up in a cottonwood grove, he feels how light and alive she was, like a bird caught in a net. Cather uses a bird simile to portray Marian in this quote, and shortly after that, Neil senses his desire to protect her. Quote, if only he could rescue her and carry her off like this. The motif of a protected bird appears here as well. Since there is only a slight difference between protection and restraint, the tree not only protects the bird, Marian, but also restricts her mobility. On a night of glorious moonlight, Neil, heading for Forrester's house, saw the black plume-like shadows of the poplars fell across the lane. About these shadows, Fredrickson acutely points out that the poplar lane restricts Marian's free movement as follows. Quote, while black bars across the lane and the former marsh, now in old poison ivy's weed, effectively paint prison bars over Mrs. Forrester's existence. End quote. Shortly after this, Neo meets Marion standing motionless outside, nearer to the house than the shadowed lane. The two walk down the lane, but they go only as far as the end of the lane and turn back again. Marion cannot get out of the boundary. Marion never leaves this lane without being escorted by a man in the novella, except when she comes in the rain to Neo's office in town to call her affair partner after learning of his marriage. In response, Neo says, you can't have crossed the creek." And he cuts the telephone line in the name of protection. Looking at the scenes in this way, I would say that Cather creates the image that Marian Forrester is in captivity inside the lane of Poplar. When reading A Lost Lady, focusing on the motifs of the tree, the commonalities appear between Cather's early works set in the prairie and this novella, which is often thought to have little connection with nature. It is one of the great attractions of Cather's fictions, the moment when the boundary between human and nature becomes ambiguous. Probably the pumpkin field scene in My Antonia is the most famous one of these moments. In A Lost Lady, as well as her other fictions, humans and nature interact, making the story multi-layered. The theme makes A Lost Lady not only a novella that vividly depicts the historical time and space of the Midwest, but also a work that can connect to a wider time and space, including ancient Bohemia and possibly Princess Mononoke. Unfortunately, we cannot see the Garber's house anymore because it was burned down in 1925. However, Cottonwood Grove is still there in former Garber's site in Red Cloud. Thank you.
Oh, I thought that's what you were going to say. I had that feeling. Okay. All right. It occurs to me too, with this momentary break, to first of all say thank you, Hiro, for that delightful paper. It's a wonderful way to start. I should also say that I am Daryl Palmer. I am a professor of English at Regis University in Denver. I could say that. Could also say that you should be starting to think about questions that you might want to ask our presenters today. And our next speaker is Patty Burris. Patty Burris's paternal great-great-grandparents, the August Westerhouse family, lived in Webster County near Blue Hill from 1894 to 1895. They left because of the drought and hard times. Cather mentions the exodus of settlers from the area during that time in Nebraska, the end of the first cycle. Burris's maternal grandfather came to Nebraska from Virginia in 1916. Both connections increase her interest in the work of Willa Cather. Burris teaches foundational English at Northeast Community College in Norfolk, Nebraska. Patty.
Thank you. Oh. Okay. the picture that you see is the picture of these flowers in this pot, and they kind of tell the whole story about a lost wetland. When I decided to do this topic, I thought, well, I work at a greenhouse in the summer, and I thought, I'll just get some wetland plants from the greenhouse. Well, you don't do that. So I got the closest I could. I got probably near cousins to the plants that are in the story. And it showed me in a hurry that you can't replicate a wetland very easily. It was really easy to just plant these in a pot of soil. But if I had, the actual wetland native plants, I would have had to maintain, less than 3 feet of water, and that would be on top of soil. And then I would need plants that would survive this. I'm sure if I just overwater these, they'll die. But to maintain a wetland plant would have been probably, I don't know, impossible or maybe even illegal. I'm not sure. But anyway, this taught me a lot. The blue plant in there, and I don't know, you can probably see it on the picture. I'm not sure you can see it. What? It's there? Okay. There we go. There we go. The ones in the pot today are probably curled up. They're really beautiful little flowers, and they are the blue-eyed grass that you read about in A Lost Lady, if you paid attention to the plants like that. And it curls up during the day, like in the morning it's curled up, and it doesn't just close like this. It curls around itself. It's really beautiful. And then it opens up when the sun shines in the afternoon. But that explains the pot. And then I also have some native grass in there too. There's little blue stem that I'll get to later. Everything is connected to everything else. This quote by ecologist Barry Commoner forms the basis of ecocriticism, according to an article by William Ruckert, and shows why the actions of poison ivy in A Lost Lady have repercussions that go beyond the exchange of a marsh for a wheat field. His actions demonstrate the sometimes unfortunate connectedness of us all. Again, according to Commoner, the science of ecology is most important, as in the basis for a human vision which Cather could see. Man's downfall will be his, quote, compulsion to conquer, humanize, domesticate, violate, and exploit every living thing, unquote. In her fiction, Cather anticipated scientific theories that had not yet taken hold. In 1938, English inventor Guy Callender claimed that as carbon dioxide increases, the Earth's temperature also rises. This eventually became the idea of global warming, even though Callender did not see it as a negative consequence. He felt that it was a good thing because it would keep us from going into another ice age, which I guess he's not wrong, but global warming isn't the great thing that he thought it might be. Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, and I'm sure some of you have read this. In 1962, Willa Cather had A Lost Lady published in 1923, well before either of these. Yet Carson and Cather share the same thought that if we wish to survive, to continue to survive, we need to work with the environment rather than trying to dominate it. It took nearly 50 years after the publication of A Lost Lady for us to value wetlands enough to create legislation for their protection. In 1971, the Ramsar Convention explored the possibility that humans stop destroying wetlands and the environment in general. And so this was a worldwide convention. Then in the United States, major legislation in 1972 in the form of the Clean Water Act, 1977, the Carter Protection Act for Wetlands, and 1985, the Swamp Buster Act. Those have all helped regulate the use of wetlands. Some farmers object strongly to these laws because of right now the record high prices for land. They want production, not a preserve. In the news currently, and you've probably seen this, is the Supreme Court's ruling that the Clean Water Act overreaches and should only apply to wetlands that are connected to larger bodies of water that are regulated. This will have catastrophic effects, I'm afraid. To read A Lost Lady is to read the story of not only Marion Forrester, but about the plants and the land, and in this case, the wetland. A Lost Lady abounds with plant references. The plants serve as a sort of leitmotif for the main characters. For example, Mr. Forrester and the briar rose, probably brought from Kentucky or Virginia, like some of Cather's characters, can often appear together. So I wanted to share this drawing with you, and it's from 1913 from an illustrated book of botany. But then, and if you have grown children who still have stuff in your house, does anybody have that going on? You'll believe this next part. I was working on this and took a break and went downstairs and vacuumed my daughter's room, who the daughter's long gone, but this was still in there, and it's just a gift bag. But to me, that's probably what the briar rose looks like. If anybody would like to have this, please take it. It would be a good start to clearing her from the room. Mr. Forrester and the briar rose are connected. Mrs. Forrester's theme seems to come from her pale, beautiful cheeks, which had always the fragrant crystalline whiteness of white lilacs. Poison ivy Peters, however, has a less honorable connection to nature and plants, which begins his disrespect for the natural world as a child and continues well into his adulthood. From the graphic bird blinding incident to the displacement of Indians in Wyoming to the draining of the marsh, ivy becomes the embodiment of greed at the expense of the environment. Quote, he felt that ivy, and it's talking about Neil here, felt that ivy had drained the marsh quite as much to spite him and Mrs. Forrester as to reclaim the land. It is noteworthy that draining the marsh is referred to as reclaiming the land, but today such land is converted wetland. A wetland serves as a refuge and habitat for wild animals, birds, and fish. A specialized ecosystem, the wetland nourishes its inhabitants, both wildlife and plants. In his book entitled Nebraska's Wetlands, Their Wildlife and Ecology, the late Paul A. Johnsgaard, well-known ecologist and UNL professor emeritus, provided a list of plants that grow in Nebraska marshes or wetlands. Cather and Johnsgaard wrote about some of the same plants. Watercress, is one of them, and that's a member of the nasturtium family. Swamp milkweed, cottonwoods, like you talked about. Blue-eyed grass, which actually isn't a grass, it belongs to the iris family. Willow stump, in which, in Cather, maybe from the peach-leaved willow that Johnsgaard mentions. Honeysuckle and lilies that smell far worse than weeds. Plants which originate in the British Isles, then transplant to Virginia and Kentucky, and on to Nebraska, mirror characters' own migration to Nebraska. Native to Britain are honeysuckle, sweetbriar rose, and common dog violet. The wildlife that populates Cather's marsh or rainwater lagoons consists of the unfortunate woodpecker, the ducks the boys enjoy for their cultural evening at Mrs. Forrester's, rabbits, and birds and butterflies that darted everywhere. Several species of ducks and woodpeckers are noted in Johnsgaard's The Nature of Nebraska, Ecology and Biodiversity, emphasizing the importance of wetlands as spring staging areas for migratory birds. Once again, Johnsgaard reminded us that due to the elimination of wetlands, migrant bird populations now congregate in concentrated places, which results in greater potential for diseases, and we've seen this. Today, according to the U.S. National Park Service, wetlands, quote, provide a home for at least 1/3 of all threatened and endangered species. And over half the American waterfowl have their breeding grounds in prairie potholes. More than half of the wetlands that existed in the continental United States in the late 1700s have been destroyed. This is according to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service study in 1990. Further, the loss of natural marshes has resulted in the necessity of creating man-made flood control. Don Preston, who, by the way, served as a summer intern in Red Cloud in 1988, there may be somebody here who remembers him, is a resource conservationist with the Natural Resources Conservation Service branch of the USDA in Wayne, Nebraska. Preston describes the importance of wetlands and the consequences when farmers want to remove a wetland in order to grow more corn. One of the essential functions of the wetland is to aid in the conversion of carbon dioxide to organic carbon molecules. So destroying a wetland means the loss of the wetland filter, the habitat, and ecosystem. Flooding and erosion are likely to occur in the nearby land. Flooding is exactly what happens after ivy destroys the marsh. Ivy lacks the appreciation for the wetland the captain had. Quote, "In the Forester Lane, the scent of sweet clover hung heavy. It had always grown tall and green here since Neil could remember. The captain would never let it be cut until the weeds were mowed in the fall. The black, plume-like shadows of the poplars fell across the lane and over Ivy Peters' wheat field." And so this is a picture of Lombardy poplars that I found online, and interesting enough, which matches with exactly what you said, the link is labeled fast growing trees. And so these are the Lombardy poplars. And I thought to myself, I don't think I've ever seen anything like this in Nebraska. I probably haven't, because they don't winter over. Fields such as Ivy's wheat field divided the land into measured plots to be plowed, planted, and harvested. A wetland such as the one the captain and Neil appreciated for its beauty was no longer part of a productive, profitable future. It was to some merely a wasteland. And this is a quote from when Neil is going out to the captain's place in the morning early. "The sky was burning with the soft pink and silver of a cloudless summer dawn. The heavy bowed grasses splashed him to the knees. All over the marsh, snow on the mountain globed with dew made cool sheets of silver, and the swamp milkweed spread its flat, raspberry-colored clusters. There was an almost religious purity about the fresh morning air, the tender sky, the grass and flowers with the sheen of early dew upon them. Neil wondered why he did not often come over like this to see the day before men and their activities had spoiled it. 100 years ago, Willa Cather could see the harm in draining a marsh. Described as the lungs of the planet by David Bellamy of the Conservation Foundation in London, the wetland filters the water, helps prevent flooding, and preserves coastlines. Don Preston says that for a plot to be designated a wetland, it must consist of soil, hydrology, and plants. More than 3 feet of water means no plants. Other names for wetlands are slough and marsh. A type of linear wetland is a creek. In Nebraska, the end of the first cycle, Cather describes in great detail the buffalo wallows and the plants that were able to grow in the water that was held by those wallows. The ground underneath was rubbed hard and held water during times of rain. Wild ducks swam in them, and the golden coreopsis, so that's the plant you see, that is a coreopsis. It's probably not this coreopsis, but it is one, referred to as lagoon flower, grew rooted in the water. And I noticed there's also a painting downstairs of the lagoon flowers, so that would be a type of coreopsis down there. And the painter accurately has them rooted in the water. They're out there. And maybe these were the original rainwater wetlands. In the same piece, Cather seems disdainful of those who are ready to exchange the hard work and persistence of one generation for the ready-made convenience of the next. Quote, stamped with the ugly crest of materialism, end quote. They were all about show and not about the virtues that made Nebraska a place where many different nationalities could come together and create a home. Cather's generation saw the prairie turn into plowed land. Man has caused many changes to the landscape. Bertha Cook Goodling, born in 1906, wrote her observations in Things I Remember Before 1930, and recalls when the prairie hay used to feed the workhorses contained many flowers, sweet williams or dianthus, and bluebells. Later, when the land had been plowed, there were fewer desirable plants, there were plants that were less desirable, such as bindweeds, which nearly took over and are a problem to this day, cockleburs and sandburs, even though they lived where there was no sand. Goodling described the orchards and honeybees that her uncle had. They used honey for everything, as well as sold honey. Bees were everywhere, even in the outhouse, she writes. The honey was squeezed out of the comb with a sausage stuffer. Among the apple trees, there were no weeds, only nice bluegrass. Also, no worms in the apples. Goodling also describes the wetlands. We also had lots of pasture land with a creek running through it. They call those creeks sloughs in Nebraska. She also noted that there were, quote, very few trees in Nebraska at that time except along the rivers, end quote. As Paul A. Johnsgard searched for hope in our uses of the earth, he credited the Nature Conservancy, which owned the Willa Cather Memorial Prairie, for saving wetlands. The Willa Cather Foundation acquired the area in 2006 with the assistance of, and I got that information from this pamphlet, with the assistance of the Nature Conservancy. Supporting efforts like the Willa Cather Memorial Prairie can preserve native plants and unplowed ground for future generations. Johnsgard wrote, nothing is more valuable than water. And one of the basic tenets of eco-criticism is that everything is connected to everything else. Given those statements, eco-criticism carries with it the responsibility of action. Each of us can do something. If you teach, you can use a collaboration between English or literature and conservation or biology. Lessons could include a reading from A Lost Lady and having a guest lecturer or co-teacher cover the science part of the lesson. Planting a themed garden is another possibility for bringing Cather's books to life. The gardener could select some of the plants that Cather mentions in her books. A native garden plot containing such grasses as little blue stem, big blue stem, and or switchgrass could be the beginning of a more eco-friendly lawn. Starting small is best since the project can be long-term and overwhelming otherwise. Permaculture gardening, according to Bill Mollison, is, quote, a philosophy of working with rather than against nature, of protracted and thoughtful observation rather than protracted and thoughtless labor, and of looking at plants and animals in all their functions rather than treating any area as a single product system. And this is a quote from the Galax Gazette in Virginia. It also reminds me of the Indians who are mentioned in A Lost Lady, who generally worked with nature rather than trying to dominate, but were displaced by poison ivy. Another way to encourage eco-friendliness is by selecting children's books, like the Paula Wallace books that are down in the bookstore downstairs. Beatrix Potter books, which were published in 1902. In 2022, an exhibit of her talent in drawing was exhibited at the V&A Museum in England. And she left her farm to the National Trust, and as a child spent a lot of time exploring outdoors, which is important. She kept the hide of her beloved rabbit Benjamin to help her get every detail right in her drawings. Barry Commoner pointed out that the reason for our environmental crisis is that the very ways that we make money are the ways that destroy our environment. By draining the marsh, Ivy had obliterated a few acres of something he hated, and this is in A Lost Lady. though he could not name it, and had asserted this power over the people who had loved those unproductive meadows for their own idleness and silvery beauty, end quote. We now know what Cather knew 100 years ago. To lose a wetland is to lose something very valuable indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you, Patty, for that wonderful talk and bringing your own wetland with you, which almost, which that probably has not been done in this auditorium before, and so that was lovely. Our final speaker today is Jung-Young Lee. Jung-Young Lee is a professor of English education at Yungnam University in South Korea. He received his PhD in English literature from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. His published book and articles are History and Utopian Disillusion, The Dialectical Politics in the Novels of John Dos Passos, and an article, The Narrative Force and Limit of Richard Wright's Native Son and the Dialectics of Necessity and Accident, and another article, A Dialectical Reflection on the Practical Materialism, Beyond the Dualism of Idealism and Materialism. And with that, John?
Oh, hello everyone. It's a pleasure and honor to me to read my paper in this renowned conference. And then, before reading my paper, it's better for me to confess that I'm not a Cather expert, even ignorant to Cather's novels. And then, in fact, at first, when I studied in Lincoln, Nebraska, and when I read Cather's novel at first, I didn't like it that much. And then, although I read My Antonia and O Pioneers, they are not that impressive. But when I come back to my country, and then I decided to use, especially My Antonia, as a textbook for my class, because My Antonia has some kind of universal storyline, so that could appeal to my students. And then I had to read every year, every semester about My Antonia, and then I began to like, and then I began to like and appreciate the real meaning, the rich symbolism of My Antonia, and then, moreover, it brings my memories in Lincoln, Nebraska, and then. From the point of view, I read My Antonia not from my brain, from the bottom of my heart. So I decided to write a paper, and then here I am. So introduce my paper, and then sometimes ignorance is a bliss. Sometimes ignorance is a bliss. So if I propose some preposterous and ridiculous proposition about Cather's novel, please forgive me. And then sometimes ignorant people are sometimes very brave. So, and then at first the title of my paper is not dealing with a lost lady, but I included the area of my concern, a lost lady, because in consideration of the main topic of this conference. So the final title of my paper is Land, Labor, and Capital in O Pioneer, My Antonia, and A Lost Lady, Willa Cather's Ambivalence Toward Nature and Economy. O Pioneer, My Antonia, and A Lost Lady, the three earlier novels of Willa Cather, have been widely celebrated as an epitome of substantializing the ecological ideal of ecocriticism. The human and nature harmoniously go together to compose the environment itself, although A Lost Lady ends in a tragedy of losing the forest place in which human and nature coexist in a beautiful harmony. In fact, no modern American novelist is more famous for the drama of environment than Willa Cather herself. Therefore, in her novels, the reader should expect to see the drama of humans intertwined with that of nature, especially with the drama of Nebraska Prairie. Even the landscape of nature itself grows and changes along the human characters in her novels, as Jim Burden of My Antonia says at the end of the novels, that seeing the change of the old pastoral land is like watching the growth of a great man or a great idea. With all those ecological features of Willa Castle's Nebraska novels, however, it is very skeptical and problematic to see them as the ecological embodiment of pure environmental imagination. With all her reputation as the artist of environment, it is also hard to see the plots of the novels emerge organically from the atmosphere and setting of natural environments. Rather, the land of Nebraska Prairie has not come alive until a human face was set toward it with love and yearning. As Alexandria pioneers think that the history of every country begins in the heart of a man or a woman. Moreover, unlike the ecological idea that nature exists self-sufficiently in itself, the prairie land, by the investment of human hearts, woke up out of its sleep and stretched itself, and it also big storage, which is quoted from the text itself, making Alexandra rich too. In a lost lady, the forest place, the symbol of the ecological ideal, is in fact the product of the railroad industry, a capital of the mega enterprise at the time. It is ironical that by use of Captain Daniel Forester's accumulated capital, who has worked for the railroad industry, the broad meadow of the half pasture and half marsh at Sweetwaters turns in an ideal ecological garden defended from industrial exploitation. It may not be unreasonable to argue that in Pioneer, the change of the land should have a strong resemblance with the movement of the capital. In a society of capitalism, the circular movement of the capital produces profit endlessly, making each owner rich as Alexandra becomes rich by the land itself, not by her hardworking labor, unlike her brothers Lou and Oscar, who are hardworking farmers. In contrast with Alexandria, who seems not to give much value to hardworking labor, Antonia is a hardworking farmer. She changed herself somewhat in harmony with the change of the land. However, Antonia is still not rich, at least materially. Although Jim Burden, who works for a big business of the railroad industry, glorifies Antonia and her farmers, he never appreciated hardworking Antonia. Antonia boasted how much she could lift and endure. Jim didn't like that. In a lost lady, the gentle pioneer, Captain Daniel Forrester, earned his resources from the big business in order to create an ideal ecological place. Therefore, in a way, the beauty of the Forrester place depends on the surplus profit produced by the hardworking railroad workers. Willa Catton never had been a hardworking farmer, spending her life mostly in New York. In this regard, it seems that, like under Alexandra Burden and the Foresters, Catton maintained an ambivalent attitude toward the land and labor, as well as nature and capital. Therefore, this presentation tries to deal with Catton's suspected ambiguous attitude toward nature and economy. Although there has been a strong consensus that Catton's earlier novels have been loaded as prototypes of nature's dramas, practicing ecological imagination, most of these dramas actually begin with when individual human beings decided to invest their money and time to the landscape of nature in purpose of earning not only use value, but also surplus value if their business is successful. Therefore, it may not be a misinterpretation that Catton's narratives of ecological imagination should be so subordinated to the process of creating use and surplus values for individuals like Alexandra and Captain Forrester, as well as for industrial capitals like the railroad industry. In this sense, these three novels of Catton have some contradictory conceptions of the Nebraskan prairie, in which the prairie has been recognized as self-sufficient ecological beauty itself, and at the same time, the prairie lies as an industrial capital that reflects desire and avarice of people living in it. So in many cases, the land of nature in her novels operates following the economic principle of industrial capitalism. It turns out that eventually the people who perceived well the economic principle of capital working in the prairie land have enjoyed tremendous material success. It is Alexandria in O Pioneers who understands intuitively the potential value of capitalist investment in the prairie land called the Divide. When she climbs to the higher end of the Divide, she has awakened to the genius of the Divide, the great free spirit which breathed across it. So let me quote from the part of the Pioneer. Her eyes drank in the breaths of it until her eyes blinded her. Then the genius of the Divide, the great, the free spirit which breathed across it, must have been royal than it ever bent to a human ear before. The history of every country begins in the heart of a man, of a woman, unquote. Then, as tears blind her eyes, she may think the genius of the Divide as the financial capital hidden in the prairie land, because its movement as a free spirit is very similar to a circulation of capitalist money. As she knows, quote, the history of every country begins in the heart of a man, of a woman, unquote. So that from the heart of Alexandra, an idea of investment rises like the free spirit. Therefore, she takes out a bank loan and purchases the land despite the strong objection of her brothers, Lou and Oscar. Eventually, her shrewd and astute financial investment on nature saved the deteriorating Ferguson family and her family farm, not the hard labor of her brothers. When Carl Lidstrom, a wandering fine artist and a husband-to-be of Alexandra, asked her how come she is so rich and prosperous, she says that, quote, we hadn't any of us much to do with it, Carl. The land did it. It pretended to be poor because nobody knew how to work it right. Then, all at once, it worked itself. It woke up out of its sleep and stretched itself, and it was so big, so rich, that we suddenly found we were rich just from sitting still. Like this, unquote, like this, Alexandria confesses that it is not her work or her hard labor, but the land that works itself, which makes her rich and reveals her family farm. She has not done significant work, but waited until the property value of the divide rises high in the capitalist market. Moreover, the land itself moves independently, like a circulating movement of the capital in capitalist society. As much as capital makes surplus value with the circulation in the market, the Nebraskan land makes profit for Alexandria. In this respect, nature and capital not only coexist, but interact each other to make us surplus value without the necessity of hard labor. In a way, this novel seems to be a guidebook for real estate investment, the emphasis of which lies on the market-friendly investment, not on hard labor of farmers. In a lost lady, the forest place also represents pure ecological beauty of nature untouched by the hands of industrial capitalism. At the same time, the forest place can be seen as a proud trophy for Captain Forrester, who has been a successful pioneer supported by the growing capital of the railroad industry. Because Captain Forrester accumulated substantial capital by working as a pioneering railroad constructor, he can afford to leave the place as it is. There is no need for him to cultivate the place as a farmland. In a way, Marian Forrester is, as much as the place itself, a trophy wife with whom he displays his wealth and achievement as a pioneer. Quote from the text, anyone but Captain Forrester would have drained the bottomland and made it into a highly productive field, but he had selected this place long ago because it looked beautiful to him, and he happened to like the way the creek wound through his pasture with mint and joint grass and twinkling willows along its bank, unquote. If the forest place is the product of affluent capital of a railroad builder, the place is to be disappeared as soon as the fall of the railroad builder. Not to mention the builder's wife, like Marian Forrester. Marian Forrester is an embodiment of the woman of leisure class, of whom Sostheim Beverin once explained in his classic, The Theory of the Leisure Class. Moreover, it may not be ridiculous argument that the primitive environment of the forest place has been used as a cover-up for capitalist exploitation of the Great Prairie, as much as a device to satisfy his desire to show off his aristocratic taste for art as a railroad artist. At the same time, the society of the Sweetwater divided into two contrasting social classes. One class was made of homesteaders and handworkers. The other class, railroad aristocrats, as many classes has proposed. Representing the latter one, Captain Forrester has spent his money for conspicuous consumptions, the commodities of which are the Forrester Place and Marian Forrester. Like Captain Forrester, Jim Borden, who is a sole narrator of My Antonia, also works for the railroad industry, although he has been said to have a romantic disposition throughout his career. He is very flexible to defend the profit of the big company as a lawyer. However, he seems to idealize Antonia and her family as if they are living in their own pastoral garden of Eden, even though Antonia still has to have labored hard as a farmer to support her own family. Jim's idealization of Antonia can be attributed to his sense of loss that he felt in his life subjugated to the principle of industrial capitalism. Like Carl Lindstrom, Jim Borden has been wandering around the American town by the Great Western Railways. Even though his home is in New York, like Kether, Jim has led a careless, unhappy married life with a renowned patroness to a young artist of New York. Like most of vagabonds and wanderers, Jim needs to have very good memories and recollections of a hometown that comforts his sense of emptiness or hollowness in his life. That is why he romanticizes the past memories with Antonia and transforms her into a Mother Nature figure who presiding over her family garden. Bluntly said, Jim, as a capitalist businessman, intended to objectify Antonia and her place of the great prairies as commodities for giving consolations to the profit-pursuing bleakness of industrial capitalism. As always, modern capitalism reterritorializes, reuse the anti-industrial ecological nature, such as Forester's Place and Antonia's homestead farm, into a new category of commodity. So Jim Borden unconsciously plays a part of it. Quote, for 5, perhaps 10 minutes, the two luminaries confronted each other across the level-land, resting on opposite edge of the world. In the singular light, every little tree and shock with every sunflower stalk and crumb of snow on the mountain drew itself up high and pointed, unquote. This beautiful narration of the Nebraska Prairie by Jim at dusk would have a charge of Jim's unintentional reterritorialization of the Great Prairie into an abstract object of painting, which gives him a consoling memory of the old poor of the earth in the Nebraska Prairie. So, as I have discussed so far, it is pretentiously ambivalent that nature and capital coexist in the earlier novels of Willa Cather, which has been regarded as a role model of ecological literature, realizing environmental imagination. However, without the help of capital, the dramas of nature in those Cather's novels would not be initiated, since they belong to, in a significant way, the commodity logic of industrial capitalism, which reflects economic desire of people. This contradictory duality of the environmental imagination in such novels as O Pioneers and My Antonia and Lost Lady could be attributed to their negligence of the value of labor, as well as the hardworking laborers in the prairie town. Among among major characters of those novels, it is Antonia alone, who is really a hardworking farmer, laboring endlessly in order to make ends meet. Otherwise, Alexandria is rather close to real estate investor, Captain Forrester, an entrepreneur of the railroad, and Jim Burton, a lawyer for the big business. Of course, Willa is also far from a hardworking laborer. This group of main characters reflect the pretentious cohabitation of capital and nature, and furthermore, it also suggests the negligence of the value of labor. Against the negligence of labor and laboring workers, prompted by the pretentious interaction between nature and capital, as well as the commercialized objectification of the prairie land by industrial capitalism, it is Antonia, the sole laborer character, who is able to generate the vision that can resist against the capitalist appropriation of the Nebraskan prairie with the creative procession of genuine labor. So I think my final hope is on Antonia as a hardworking farmer. In other words, the life of Antonia as a pioneering woman would offer a clue to surpass the reification of labor and the commodification of the prairie land. Although there is a limit for perceiving true aspects of Antonia's life, because her story is narrated from the perspectives of the non-laboring intellectual Jim Burton. Even though Yurakedo is the author of these three novels, she could not completely perceive all aspects of Antonia's life, since Kedo was also a product of social strata. However, with all these obstacles, the readers and critics of Kedo's work are hopefully able to inspire to be awakened to the way how Antonia sympathizes with the nature of the Nebraskan prairie, which goes beyond the exploiting alliance between capital, nature, and human beings. And then if the work of literature is a living organism, as people say, the literary characters are also living organisms. Therefore, their existential meaning and capability could run over the limit of literary text itself. This is the end of my paper. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Jung. It was a heartfelt paper. I felt the heart in it. Thank you very much. We have time for some questions, a few questions. The next event coming up, I think you all know, is the artist's reception. I think it's downstairs, 4:30. So we have a few minutes for some questions before we end. And if you would do, I think you could do the cards, and I'll start. We have a couple already. Question for Hiro. I love the studio. Is it pronounced Studio Ghibli? Ghibli? Yes, I wasn't sure if I had it right. The Studio Ghibli reference. You mentioned the contrast between nature and industrial qualities in A Lost Lady and in Studio Ghibli movies, which often include characters or creatures or parts of nature not immediately visible to some. I'm curious if you think something similar is happening in A Lost Lady. Is Cather intentionally obscuring trees and nature? Who gets to really see the birds and the trees in her book? And if you all could use the microphone there, that would be. There. All right, I'm going to repeat the question, but I'm going to make it a little tighter and just simply say, it sounds like in the movies that you talked about, the Studio Ghibli movies, we see nature and trees that most people wouldn't see. I think the tree spirits, for instance, right? Is Cather trying to do something similar? Are you suggesting that Cather's doing something similar in A Lost Lady? And are there any particular characters who really do see the birds and the trees in the novel? I hope I did justice to the question.
I don't necessarily think the natural things in Kader's fictions are not visible. The names are suggesting like Daniel Forrester is a forester. Ivy Peters is an ivy. And then bird similes are really obvious. And but I wouldn't say I see all those invisible things in Kader's fictions, and there must be a lot more. So yeah, I'd love to look for more of them.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that answer. Question for Patty. Professor Burris, thank you for the specific suggestions for teachers and academics. You mentioned the relations between Cather and nature and conservancy. Is there an opportunity to partner again in wetland education funding? Is there maybe other opportunities to partner with funding? If it's your question, feel free to, And I can translate to, I'll do it too. So the question, in case you couldn't hear, the question is that Patty had already talked about some opportunities and some relationships, right, for funding. And what are the other opportunities out there right now? Do you have some ideas?
And I haven't looked into that, but it certainly sounds, like there should be some grants out there for things to educate kids about wetlands so that when they grow up, maybe they do better than we. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Question for Jung. I think this is about land and labor. It seemed that Antonia put labor on the same level as land, but discounted labor to some degree. Shall I do that again? Say that again?
Discounted labor.
In other words, it seemed that Antonia put labor on the same level, so she valued labor and land, but it seemed ultimately that she didn't value labor quite as much.
Cather.
Oh, Antonia.
Antonia. One of the one of the some regrettable fact over the novel by Antonia is that there's not much real voice of Antonia. Antonia's voice is coming from Jim Burton or Widow Stevenson and someone else. If I heard a direct voice from the Antonia, maybe our thinking about the labor itself is it's true. In some fact, at first Antonia didn't like labor under the hot sun because she wants to go to she wanted to receive some education. But when in a certain circumstance, Antonia is doing some labor, hard working, and then something changed to Antonia. Maybe it's, I don't propose that nature is not changed static, but nature and human being is changing by the course by the intercourse of the genuine labor. And then may Antonia realize at the end of after she grown up, at the end of her life, Antonia may realize the value of genuine labor. But that is not narrated by Jim Burton or any other narrators. Because at the critical moment of Antonia's life, and then Antonia's voice has disappeared. It's kind of some disappearing act. Some critics have said that. So that would be some regrettable facts in my Antonia. and then one of the another reason why Jim Burton and Ira Keller and including me bring back to the memory of those past is that something is still not unsolved. Something is uncomfortable. That's why, although some people receive some comforts from the memory of the past, but another reason is that something is still there. There's a, so what is it still there? It is, we don't know exactly, but that offers some another possibility of interpretation.
Thank you. Thank you. It's helpful. Hiro, a question for you. We have two more questions. Question for you, Hiro. This person thanks you for a wonderful presentation and noted the connections between nature and characters in the novel and is focusing on Captain Forster in particular. So the captain transforms the landscape in terms with the railroad, but he chooses not to develop his own land. What do you think of this dichotomy in his character? Feels like a contradiction there.
Yeah, that is a big question, and I cannot think of the answer off the top of my head. Yeah, it's a big contradiction. Yes. Yeah, before I started writing about this tree and birds thing, I wanted to write about the wetland, and I wanted to write about the resilience of that marsh after Ivy Peters changed it into wheat field. It rains a lot, and the creek or marsh, I don't know how to call it, appears again, and I love the scene. And yeah, I'm not answering to the question, but yeah, but I like the scene.
Yeah, I'm tempted. I bet you're thinking of other possibilities, but thank you. That's good. I love the panelist yesterday who actually who had the question. In fact, it was Juan, wasn't it, who had the question. It was like, how do you answer that question? So you drop the mic. That's the solution. And then everybody says, yep, that's the end of that show. A couple more quick questions. And I'm going to tie this one together because the folks out there are interested in Ivy Peters. Ivy Peters is clearly our villain. His destruction of the land seems to this questioner almost as bad, just in that same way as torturing the woodpecker. Is that true? And then a fascinating question. So it's a two-pronged Ivy Peters question, which I guess is for you, Patty, but we're all kind of doing the same novel. And Ivy Peters' name comes from poison ivy, the plant. He is poisoned, but does poison ivy itself cause harm other than making humans itch to wetlands? Does poison ivy harm the land? Discuss. Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Does anybody in here know? Oh, go ahead.
Doesn't.
Okay.
No.
Thank you.
If it were an invasive species and doing that, it would be. That's interesting. That's an interesting question. That's fun.
But it is a vine, so
It does.
it would
reaches up, grows up. Yeah.
it would be somewhat invasive, I would think.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good question.
Yeah. Mhm. Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if it's invasive or not, but in when I'm doing my research, I read something about those IVs is get damaged trees. They they goes up and the cottonwood trees, and sometimes it can be bad for the tree, uh, but good or bad are, in my opinion, is something humans decide and nature doesn't care.
Yeah, that's an excellent answer. One quick qualification, last question, just a quick qualification. Someone would like, Patty, you to say just another couple words, because I think you referred to the Supreme Court decision, and is it your sense how much of the wetlands now are now in danger?
A lot, really. They ruled that if a wetland is connected to a body of water that's regulated, then the wetland can be regulated. But just a wetland, and then I think that opens it up for just a wetland on its own wouldn't be covered anymore, and it has been up until now.
Okay.
Yeah. So
right.
if somebody wanted to, just drain it and farm through it, they could. And now they have to get a permit. There's a program if you want to take land that has a wetland, if you want to take the wetland out, then you can substitute another piece of land, but it costs $20,000 per acre to create a wetland. So it's a very expensive thing to try to recreate.
Showing once again that Cather is relevant all the time. She's never not relevant. Thank you so much for Hiro, Patty, Jung. Great spirited lectures. Applause. Thank you.